Welcome. I'm Laura, your LiTFUSE muse for the evening. Thank you for joining LiTFUSE and Tieton Arts and Humanities for our second installment of this year's LiTFUSE Online Summer School Series, featuring our 2022 faculty. All summer school events are free and open to the public, with more to come. So spread the word, and we're really happy that you came tonight. I'm the Assistant Director for the LiTFUSE program, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging that Tieton Arts and Humanities exists on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Confederated Tribes and Bands of the Yakima Nation. Tieton Arts and Humanities, along with LiTFUSE, values all relationships that reinforce our commitment to art as a powerful tool for equity and diversity. In recognizing the history and respecting the sovereignty of Washington's Indian nations, we recognize and honor these first people and their significant role today in stewarding these lands as they continue to honor and uphold their ancient heritage. LiTFUSE Summer School online offerings are brought to you by our parent organization, Tieton Arts and Humanities, along with generous grant support from Humanities Washington, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Poetry Foundation, National Endowment for the Arts, Washington State Arts Commission, Fresh Hop Ale Festival, Yakima Chief Hops, Discurin Foundation, and Yakima Valley Community Foundation. And we're also going to give a shout out to our community partners, Inklings Bookstore, Fiesta Foods, Yakima Coffee House Poets, and our many individual gracious donors. Of course, I'd also like to thank the LiTFUSE 2022 faculty, especially Kathryn Hunt and Matthias. Do I say it Svalina? Close? Svalina? All right, I forgot to ask you about that. And along with our director, Jen Lynn, she was unable to make it tonight, but she says hello. All of these people, thank you for making this pre-program possible. At this time, I'd like to ask everyone to mute your audio and keep it muted throughout the presentation unless prompted to offer comments or questions by the faculty. We'll reserve the chat function for presentation-oriented responses only, although feel free to private message me with any LiTFUSE questions, pre-program, or about the upcoming workshop September 23rd through the 25th in Tieton, so less than a month. Okay, on to the main event. This evening's talk is called Narrative, Lyric, and Lyric Narration with Kathryn Hunt and Matthias Felina. Kathryn Hunt lives on the coast of the Salish Sea. She is author of 2 poetry collections, Long Way Through Ruin and Seed Wheel, and a chapbook, The Country I Come From. Her poems have appeared in Orion, Radar, and Terrain, among others. She's worked as a waitress, ship scaler, short order cook, bookseller, printer, food bank coordinator, filmmaker, and freelance writer. Her film, No Place Like Home, premiered at the Venice Film Festival in Italy. Matthias Felina is the author of 7 books, most recently The Depression, a collaboration with the photographer John Pack, published by Civil Coping Mechanisms in 2020. His book, Thank You Terror, is forthcoming in 2023. Svalina was a founding editor of Octopus Books and has led writing workshops in universities, libraries, community spaces, and in prison. Since 2014, he has run a dream delivery service, traveling around the country to deliver dreams to subscribers. With the Dream Delivery Service, he has worked with the Denver Museum of Contemporary Art, the Poetry Foundation, and the University of Arizona Poetry Center, among other organizations. So let's give a warm Zoom welcome to tonight's guest faculty, and we'll let them take over from here.
I'll start things off. Thank you, Laura, and thank you, Jen, out there in the ether, and everybody connected to LiTFUSE. What we're going to do, we're going to read a couple of poems of ours that sort of put some context of our own writing in relation to lyric and narrative, and then we're going to start a conversation about the ideas of lyric and narrative in poetry, and then move on to some poems that sort of exemplify it and talk through the ideas with those. And if at any time you have especially if in the middle of one of my poems, maybe if you have a question, put it in the chat or let us know. I think it'd be really funny actually if you heckled me or interrupted me in the middle of my poems, but probably no one's going to do that. So I'm going to read two poems, and I sort of cycle back and forth between fabulist or surrealist narrative and what I think of as more lyric and autobiographical work. So there's one of each. The first one's from this upcoming book of mine called Thank You, Terror, which takes its title from the Alanis Morissette song, Thank You. And this poem I wrote yesterday, but it's a rewrite of a poem that I wrote in the subway for my friend Allison Titus in 2008. Thank You, Terror. I didn't know when I first heard that song, Long December, by the Counting Crows, that I'd keep hearing it throughout my life, less frequently and with longer and longer intervals between iterations. The song each time different and the song each time the same. A labyrinth is a single crooked path leading into its own heart. Each turn a bewilderment, each bewilderment a chance to have faith. Once you've arrived at the labyrinth's heart, you must turn around and walk the same way out. The walls, once exhilarating, now just things you'll never see again. You must turn around and walk back your life, or you'll remain forever at the end of the story, in a daily Hollywood so undone by eyes that you ossify into a canyon that someone names, and beside which someone else builds a parking lot, and then trails and signs. And on weekends, well-meaning people walk the same trails, take the same photos of the same vistas and the same rock features, images they could buy in more artful, more professional iterations on postcards at the gift shop, by the parking lot, with the bathroom that will, like a fable without a moral, forever be out of paper towels. Yet they prefer to take their own photos. I didn't know what it would feel like losing faith. It didn't feel like anything. I have ended up with too much. I keep scratching an old scar in my knee, scratching until I draw blood, which is based on a real scar, on a real knee. And this is a dream I wrote today. It's the final thing I've been trying to finish this for 2 months. It's for a project at the Buffalo Public Library in which there are dreams written. I wrote dreams for all these objects in the public library's reading park. So benches and flowers and shadows and the air and the grass and all the dandelions. And along the reading park, they have the names of Buffalo poets and Buffalo writers set in stone. And one of my favorite poets, Lucille Clifton's name is there. So this is the dream of Lucille Clifton's name written in stone. It's in first person because it's the name written in stone's dream. A girl stands beside my bed. Because I am a name, my bed is like a piece of paper, only colder. For sheets, I have a layer of blades. For a pillow, I have a landscape of red things. All the clocks in the city of Buffalo are burning. Do you smell the fire? I say to the girl. She opens her mouth. Her mouth is filled with flames. The flames are like a fox with closed eyes, feigning sleep. Like a fox that disappears when someone says the word fox. Within the burning clocks, the flames embrace all our names. I am in flames. I do not burn. I crawl from the flames, cleansed of what time has done to me. I am without guilt, without fear, without shame. I am the words a woman wraps around her knuckles in the dark. So I'm going to pass the baton or the conch shell maybe, to Kathryn.
Thanks for that reading. That's great. I read through your poems earlier today, and I really appreciate getting to hear them out loud.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're just trying to introduce you a little bit to what our work, and we've been thinking as we've Matthias and I have just met, but we've been having a conversation about the narrative impulse in poetry and the lyrical impulse, and the near impossibility of putting poems in one category or the other. And so we want to talk about this continuum between the two. And I don't have any right answer on any of this. I doubt Matthias would claim to either. And but we just want to bat the ball around a little. It's just a way to look at poetry and think about poetry, because we can read with two hats sometimes. We read the poem to be astonished and to not feel so lonely, but we can also read poems, as I'm sure you all do, at times, to take apart how the poem is made. So I'm going to read a couple of poems, and I think Laura is going to put these up on the share screen. I'll give her a minute to do that. So you can read along while I read these, if you like. Oh, that's great. Can everybody read it? See it on the screen? Shout out if they're not big enough. Oh, there, Laura made it even a little bigger. Thank you. Okay. Actually, yeah, we're going to just scroll down from Hamlet. I see what you've done. You've opened them both. So the Hamlet one is, and then there's a page 2 to that one. And so I'll read down that way. Yeah, good. I'll let you make that a little bigger too. Okay, reading Hamlet. Utterly empty, utterly a source. Seamus Heaney. When the others were asleep, sometimes in the silence, she took Hamlet from the shelf and read aloud the scenes where he renounced poor staggering Ophelia, or stalked the pre-dawn hours, consumed, wild to know who spilt his father's blood. And I would yawn and drift and nod until she sent me off to bed. One kiss, she'd say, and I'd begrudge her, who'd shown my father out the door, the dark play of that between us. In the moon-mown hours of her dying, only the poem she'd given me, the boundless anguish of a prince, never nearer than those far-off castled nights. So I looked through my book Seed Wheel, which was published last fall, and yeah, you can stick that back up if you want, Laura, the one Still I Have Faith. And thank you for doing this. It'd be a mess if I tried to do it myself. So reading Hamlet was from that book, and it seemed, I think of that book as having a lot of narrative poems in it, but of course, when I looked, I realized that it was really many different kinds of poems, all mixed up, lyrical and persona poems. There's a long poem in the middle that's all persona poems. So the Hamlet poem seemed the most straight ahead narrative poem I could find of my own. And then I just working on another long poem. There's about 18 poems in it, I think. And this is just one of them. I think it's the 5th or the 8th one in the series. And it'll come out in a book later this year. It's called She Who Walks the Earth. So this is one of the poems. Still, I have faith in the way the night sky parades 1,000 shades of blue, imperial, lucent, melancholy, then dark, holding everything. The marvel of that, night pulling us behind itself through the fathoms of our dreams, like a train moving through the white fire of time. Oh, child, all those ancient griefs belong to no one and everyone. So we can kind of circle back to these poems if you like later, if you have questions about them. But I think we'll move on now. I think Matthias is going to start us off just with a conversation about the narrative, the lyrical, and all places in between.
Yeah, thank you for those. Thank you, Kathryn. Yeah.
I just want to pop in and say I did put into the chat poems for lyric and narrative. That's the handout that Kathryn and Matthias prepared. So if you go into the chat and click on that PDF document, it should open for you so you can follow along.
And I've dropped in a little Word document of some other poems too. Kathryn and I are both over preparers of handouts. So even though we're probably only going to talk about like one poem each, we're giving like 10 or 12 poems each.
Many poems.
Yeah, so y'all got a lot of homework to do.
Yeah, and you can download those out of the chat too and have them to check out later.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about this because it's not talking about dreams. I think in the last like 6 years, everything that I've been asked to talk about in public has been about like dream poetry and dream writing, since that's like a lot of what I do. And I was saying before, it's been a while since I've like taught poetry classes, in a way where we're like kind of talking about like what is poetry, and I always love returning to those like sort of basic core fundamental questions of like what's cool about words, like why do we want to put words in weird orders and make weird images and like and feel things, and so coming back to like this sort of core genre ideas of poetry, of the lyric and the narrative, is really fun for me to find out how I'm bewildered now. It's sort of like this ongoing state of like checking in with like, well, what has bewildered me and in what ways now? So a little bit of sort of prepped thing about narrative that I was just going to start with. They're kind of notes toward rather than definitions, and it's kind of thinking about the sort of what narrative does with me. So when I'm thinking about narrative, I think about kind of first things is like sort of that first idea that we all think of story, of like the formal concerns of how a thing that we call a character, does a thing with language that we interpret as moving through a thing with language that we interpret as setting, so characters doing stuff. But then the second thing I think about in narrative and poetry, and this is why I think I'm always drawn to poetry, is that there's always like that unfolding of more potential in it, as the progression of gestures from the opening to the closing of the poem. That like when you have a poem, unless it's an epic, it's like if it's a relatively short poem, you have control of the whole thing right there. You have the object right there. So you are, even if it's a poem that obeys the conventions of experimental poetry or a poem that obeys the conventions of the lyric, it's a poem that you see the beginning and the end of. So the narrative is structured there in the construct of the thing. And then thirdly, it's like that way that poetry creates its own narrative with us as readers, that it's so, the poems that I love, I have long journeys with. I'm continuing to read all the poets that I put in that handout, Lucille Clifton and Larry Levis and Wang Mei and Atel Ednan. And, these poets are people I've been reading and rereading for some of them, 30 years now, and coming back to the same poems over and over again and finding myself continually on a journey with them. So it's this narrative of form with the story, this narrative of the poem itself, and then this narrative of reading engagement. And those are all the kind of narrative stuff that I get really excited about, because I love a story. Like I'm a big reader of crime novels. I love plot-driven stuff. And I love, like, especially in a crime novel, how plot will destabilize, and sort of like a crime happens, and then all of the sort of agreed upon conventions of the town are laid bare and disturbed. And so there's this place of like continuing potential. I love that with story. I don't love necessarily where story takes me, but I love that story can take me and that it does take me, and that taking part of story is really, oh, sorry. I got distracted by the chat. I'm so easily distracted. I just love like distractions, really. I love, that there's this like core thing of like the story, and that's so rarely like the thing that matters. And I think about like stories we tell each other, and we so rarely tell each other just the facts. If you think about a story that exists of just truths, that's a kind of a legal fiction or a fiction of IKEA instructions. Like they don't exist. So, if I tell the story, as I've told many times, of being a kid in Slidell, Louisiana, and stumbling into a pile of fire ants, and all the fire ants swarming up my legs, and my dad picking me up while the fire ants are all biting me, and taking me and washing the ants off with water. And I tell that story not because it's particularly interesting, it's fine, but it's not going to sell any novels. I don't tell the story because it's unique, like almost everybody in the South has stepped in some fire ants at some point. I tell it because it's my first memory. And I tell it because it's my first memory, but it's also wrong. And the way I remember it is my dad picked me up, but apparently what happened, according to my brothers, is that my oldest brother picked me up. So I tell it, partially to sort of create a portal and create a space where the story allows other things to happen. And I keep thinking of like the story, at first I was like, well, the story is the skeleton, and upon which, I see that cat, Jess. The story, I was thinking like, oh, the story is the skeleton, and and then I was like, no, I think the story is like the carcass, and out of the carcass, the fungus grows and the mushrooms grow, and all this sort of, all this portent and prodigiation, and and that's what's exciting about a story to me, is that portal that it creates, and I think why I'm drawn to poetry more than fiction as a writer is that trying to build those portals and trying to constantly think about what can I do with putting words in a particular order, with playing with sound, with playing with image, with fucking up intentionally or fucking up incorrectly, and and really find like a new portal. And I think that that's the narrative that kind of keeps with me the most, is like that attempt to make the ink on the page or the pixels on the page open, so that the poem enters our lives, very much like that classic, storyline of the stranger showing up in a new town, and then we're the town, and the poem tries to fit in. The poem changes us. Both the stranger and the town are left destabilized and reinvented. So we return to the poem again and again. We rarely read that final line as the final moment of the poem. So that's the narrative that ultimately I get more excited about with poetry, is the narrative of holding the poems with us through our lives, and finding how this set thing continues to transform itself and transform us. So that's some of my notes on narrative right now, which are borderline babble, but I like a babble. So, passing the baton back.
Okay. Well, I love your idea about a poem as a portal. I think that really is an interesting idea, because it's about connecting. It's a poem is something that connects us. And I think I'll start here with a quote from Stanley Kunitz, and maybe I'll follow that into, it'll be a portal, and we'll circle around that idea a bit. this is Stanley Kunitz. Poetry is ultimately mythology, the telling of stories of the soul, the old myths, the old gods, the old heroes have never died. They are only sleeping at the bottom of our minds, waiting for our call. So there are a few things in there I would argue with, but I think I love the idea of suggesting that the poem is an ancient practice, that we're engaged in a really old practice. We've been singing poems to each other for probably 500,000 years. And it has deep roots that, if we can look back, as we probably will a little later, to the meaning of the lyric. And I think I included a poem by Sappho in the handout you have. We look at maybe back to the Greeks in the Western tradition, but of course there are traditions that go back and back on this land where I live, certainly longer than that. And we've been doing this for a long time. I think of the poem as an experience, not about anything in particular, but as an experience that I have when I hear a poem or hear it in the silence of my own mind, when I read it from a book. It's what I feel in my body, what I experience from the poet's invitation, I think, to respond to it out of, I think, my most inward self somehow, out of my own sense of myself and the world, and bring that to the reading. And you all know that and have experienced that, but I just wanted to bring that idea into our conversation here. I think of the poem as an urgent, intimate conversation. So I think that's why I love the idea of the portal. It was really, to me, says opening something up, whatever form it's going to take. At least that, for me, is it. I mean, it's about creating this circle. This circle. You have a poem, you write the poem, you're alone usually, even if you're in a coffee shop in the local Starbucks or something, or local coffee shop. You have your own bubble around you, you're alone. And then at some point, you may have the impulse to share that with other people and create, move through the portal and create a community around that poem, because you share it and give it away and make it, allow it to be a gift that others in your world can share with you and receive within the context of their own self, their own experience, one beating heart to another. So, I say that there is this continuum of the way people write their poems. I think Matthias and I write very different poems outwardly, but we're both trying to say something that we feel compelled to say. And that's kind of where poems come from for me. As far as I know, they fall out of the sky. I don't really know where poems come from. I imagine they kind of sift down through the leaves on this place I live. I live up in the Pacific Northwest, in the northwest corner of what they call the continental US. I was born, though, further north in Alaska. So I think most poems, be they narrative, lyrical, any place in between, are a kind of mythology. We write a mythology of ourselves in our poems. We make up a story of ourselves and we write it down. And no poem contains all of us, nor can it. But it's the myth. It's a myth or story of ourselves, not myth in the sense not real. Myth is a kind of going deep. So when the poem appears and you learn something about yourself as you write it, it's speaking to you out of some deep well. Is that what? Well, Kunit said, sleeping at the bottom of our minds, but our minds are wells we'll never find the bottom of, you know? So in that sense, we, you know, the forms we're attracted to, be they narrative, lyrical, somewhere in between, surrealism, prayer. I included Joy Harjo's prayer, the Eagle Poem. Their expressions, their portals that open us up to the other who stands across from us or shares our bed or is in our small community. So yeah, many ways to conjure poetry. I think that's all I want to say about in a general sense. And I think I want to talk a little bit more about, or maybe a lot more, Matthias, about these poems that we've kind of assembled as we've been working the last couple of days toward seeing you. But maybe before we do that, we'll start with, I can start with a few of my poems, I guess, that I sent to Laura. Thank you so much, Laura, for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Did you want me to do yesterday?
Yeah, you could put those up. That it's a document of about 12 poems. Yeah, it starts right there. And we can talk about them, but before we go into a few poems, so we can bat around these ideas around narrative, a story, lyrical being kind of more the personal voice speaking with emotion, often with some kind of depth. That's the lyrical voice. And so before we go into looking at poetry in terms of those and thinking about your own poetry in terms of those, and it's something we can just try on tonight. It might not apply to you. You might not want to think about your poems that way, but tonight we're just going to play with that idea. Where do your poems, the poems you're writing and the poems you're going to write when we all meet up in Titan, where do they kind of fall? Are they stories? Do your poems have these narrative impulses to them? If so, do they subvert that? Do they wander off? Do things elbow their way into your poems that you're curious about where they came from? Why are they in there, but you let them come in? So for me, it doesn't matter if it's a poem by Ray Carver, and I think you all probably know Carver best for short stories, but he was a wonderful poet. And the last 10 years of his life, he just lived up the road here with his partner and then wife, Tess Gallagher. And, you know, his poems are fairly straightforward, but as I went through the collection, I think they have it here. Yeah, all of us. So all of us, meaning he opened a portal every time he wrote and talked and read his poems for all of us. This is a really straightforward poem. I think I have these printed out, so I'll look at those because I can see them better. So Yesterday by Ray Carver. Yesterday I dressed in a dead man's woolen underwear, then drove to the end of an icy road where I passed some time with Indian fishermen. I stepped into water over my boots, saw 4 pintails spring from a creek. Never mind that my thoughts were elsewhere and I missed the perfect shot, or that my socks froze. I lost track of everything and didn't make it back for lunch. You could say it wasn't my day, but it was. And to prove it, I have this little bite she gave me last night, a bruise coloring my lip today to remind me. So this is about as straightforward as they can get, a poem can get, in terms of anchoring itself in the imagery of the world that we perceive with our eyes and our ears and our hands. He keeps it within that boundary, kind of like Japanese haiku, who they'll say everything, they can say everything about the world with 4 lines, all of those lines within the boundary of the world we can see and touch and smell. Right? So Ray Carver's just put together I think something very wonderful in a straight ahead narrative poem. And I feel like you can find Ray's discouragement and his hope, in a sense, that life, even though it wasn't a great fishing day down at the creek, there was love in his life. A woman left a mark on his body last night. So that I'll just leave you with that.
Can I jump in real quick and just kind of
Absolutely, yeah.
I love in this poem is like this center point between never mind that my thoughts were elsewhere and I missed the perfect shot, or that my socks were, it's like the whole story of the day happens there, and I love, like, we have a narrative structure, and he's telling us the events of things, and anything that has action to it, anything that has something that might be worth describing for the sake of telling a story is offset into these two little sentences, and the emphasis instead is on the small, the intimate, the sensual memory, instead of like how even in the story, everything gets funneled into this like interiority that happens with the last couple lines and the memory. Just thinking about even in the most, Carver known for being the king of narrative, and even in that, I'm like, oh, but there's still so much of the lyric impulse in this, and there's still so much of like how interiority is created and how we're allowed as readers access to another person's interiority, in this sort of straightforward moving. So it's just something I love about this poem.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that's a beautiful way to read it. It's also basically a sonnet, and this isn't a sonnet class, but we're going to do one up in Tieton, and it's 15 lines, not, I think it's about 15 lines, not 14 lines, but it takes that turn you could say it wasn't my day. You could say it wasn't my day, but it was. So it takes the same turn as I think a lot of American poets unconsciously use the structure of the sonnet. It's just in our DNA. And then it has the couplet at the end that's just lovely. It's a 3-line, it's not couplet, but it's 3 lines. That's just lovely in it gives meaning to the whole poem. It was a good day. There's no bad days. It was a good day. Yeah. I really love that. I really love that. I think many of you will know this next poem, Those Winter Sundays. Do you know Robert Hayden's poem, Those Winter Sundays? Yeah, it's really beautiful. Matthias, would you mind reading this one?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
Those winter Sundays. Sundays too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue, black cold. Then with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather, made banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house. Speaking indifferently to him, who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices?
Oh, wonderful reading. And here's another sonnet. Here's another sonnet with a couplet at the end.
Yeah.
And Hayden has really just created this whole world. Every time I read this, I get to go back into that world, into the cabin he grew up in, into the violence of that house, the chronic angers. And it's not necessarily how Robert Hayden always wrote either. Some poems are narrative, some are lyrical. If you know his poem, Night, Death in Mississippi, that's a poem in 3 voices, in the voices of 3 white people who are recalling participating in a lynching. And it's a very experimental poem, really interesting poem. So, you know, in one person's book of poems, he or she can be giving us poems in all different kinds of places on that continuum between narrative and lyrical. But again, Hayden speaks with such a personal voice. Does anybody have any comments or questions or want to jump in? Just if you put that little hand up, Laura maybe can call on you if you would, Laura. I can't see everybody. Can you?
Kind of. Might be best if you just unmuted.
Yeah, jump in if you have a question or a comment. If not, we'll just keep moving.
You now, so you can wave your hand or pop up the.
Yeah, or just, yeah, okay. So so then I just on page, what is it? 5 of this, Laura, is a poem by Akhmatova. And you may have heard of Akhmatova or read Akhmatova. And this translation is by Stanley Kunitz and Max Hayward. And, you know, God bless the translators that bring so many wonderful poets into our lives. Words Without Borders, you all maybe have seen that website. If you haven't, you might check it out. It's all translated literature. It's really a wonderful collection website there. Anyway, this is a poem by Anna Akhmatova, the wonderful 20th century Russian poet. And I love this piece because it's you know, instead of a preface, I imagine she started the poem in 1940, so she gives this the date of 1957. And I think she worked on this poem till 1960. So of course she's living in for much of that, much of her writing life in the era of Stalin. And her son was sent to Siberia twice. So this is during the period of the terror. And I'll read it to you. It's called Requiem, Anna Akhmatova, instead of a preface. In the terrible years of the Yezhov terror, I spent 17 months waiting in line outside prison in Leningrad. One day, somebody in the crowd identified me. Standing behind me was a woman with lips blue from the cold, who had, of course, never heard me called by my name before. Now she started out of the torpor common to all of us and asked in a whisper. Everyone whispered there, "Can you describe this?" And I said, "I can." Then something like a smile passed fleetingly over what had once been her face. I love this evocation of the poet's task, or one of the tasks of a poet to witness, and it's just a story that I have never forgotten. It's a preface to a very long poem called Requiem. It was really a reckoning with the years of her young life as a poet, and then through the years of Stalin and the wars. But this story, I think, is a perfect. It's put on the poem as I put on the page as a prose poem, but it's just a perfect little narrative of a story I'll never forget. So I love it that she brought me into Leningrad. Now Petersburg again, and showed me this, brought me into that line where she stood for 17 months trying to pass a package to her son. And if your relative and your loved one hadn't was no longer alive, they simply refused to take your package. So Matthias, would you like to, do you have some narrative poems or more on that end of the spectrum, or what would you like to share? And then we can zigzag back to some more lyric poems.
Yeah, I wanted to share this poem by Wang Mei because I think, like I'm thinking about the Akhmatov poem and how excluding elements of story make it into fable or feeling like fable too, you know, that there's so little being told. And I think that urge toward concision of storytelling and poetry oftentimes creates that mythological feel or creates that fabulous feel. And excuse me.
And Matthias, you're saying if the poem is less on the narrative side that arises?
More just that that's what I see happening in that Akhmatov poem.
Uh-huh.
And this poem by Wang Mei I wanted to share because I think it does a similar kind of move in a different way. I'm going to bring it up on the screen right now.
Oh, good.
And Wang Mei is a Asian American poet who's living in Dublin, I believe. And this comes from her book Picasso's Tears, which collected a couple decades of her writing. And what I love about this poem is how it works with narrative, but it also slowly unsettles its own narrative. And through that, a kind of frightening confusion occurs, which is, I think, where the poem sits and where it makes its meaning. So I'm going to read it and then kind of just go back and sort of point out some things that I think are fascinating about her use of narrative. Given two persons. Given two persons alone together in a room, chances are one of them would have invented torture. There's room. I was 6 when I invented torture. Left with a stranger, I wanted to know where my mother was, and the person won't tell me. And didn't I make her? I made her drink water, water, glass after glass after glass. It was torture, sheer torture. All night, she let on that she didn't know, and she let me. And already, I had some idea of drowning. The drowner and the drownee. Water filling up from within, though outwardly nothing's changed. And drunk I was, taking it straight to and from the source, pure and simple, purer than pure, that simple. I will make her talk. She drinks. Oh, I was 6 foot tall, and I will live to 104. She drinks, and I was drunk, alone together forever in a room hung close to tears, to and fro, head banging heads. There's room. Neither of us would beg to stop. So we've got this story that happens in here, but when you try to clamp down on what the story is telling, it evades you. Yeah, so we have this intro that is like an idea about torture, an idea about the idea of torture and the invention of torture and the human-to-human connection that that immediately inspires violence. Then we have this story, and then we have this closing of neither of us would beg to stop. You know, this sort of urge toward violence and this delight in or this need to have that impulse. So it has this kind of fabulistic element in that there's a story and there's an interpretation of the story in the frame of the poem. And yet what she's saying, I can't quite get to. I can point toward it and I can feel toward it and I can make my own interpretations, but I'm not left being transferred a piece of information. And I think these moments of the story breaking down guide that. I made her drink water, glass after glass after glass with short torture, sheer torture all night. She let on that she didn't know, and she let me. So this sort of relationship that happens in this torturous experience of being willing to be tortured, of guiding the torture, this sort of, I don't know, relationship of power that occurs within there. And then this turn toward, already I had some idea of drowning, the drowner and the drownee, and sort of thinking about where that already comes from. If she's 6, is that a cultural thing? Is that a human thing? All these sort of things. And very little of the story is story rich. We don't get setting. We don't get the grounding of the story in the sense details, the kind of things that often get taught of like, this is how you do a story well. This is how you get a reader to care about a story. Like use all 5 senses, all these sort of like workshop tricks. And instead we get a turn like, oh, I was 6 feet tall and I will live to 104. She drinks and I was drunk. And then this turn toward this transcendent moment of alone together forever. And it's this use of story to both progress an attempt at profundity, but also disturb an attempt at ever reaching that profundity. We have a lesson about violence here. We have a lesson about how violence is integrated into human nature, but we don't have a lesson that you can take away from it. Instead, we have this experiential turn, this turn toward interpretation and introspection by the reader. Yeah, that's the things I'm looking at in this, that I'm also, once I start to compare it to things that are more traditionally narrative, like Carver, I'm like, well, he's doing the same thing. It's always this way that story is allowing us to do more than just hear the story. And I think we know that, this is, we tell ourselves stories in order to live and all that kind of stuff, but it's like, when it comes into poetry, it gets so much more refined and it gets so much more focused that I get delighted by it. This is just me fanning out in poetry, I think. Yeah, and I just wanted to throw that in the mix with the other poems.
Yeah, I really like that. It makes me, Laura, if you could put up the poem on page 3, it makes me think that this is it's interesting one. Yeah, Testimony Over Tape Recorder by E.J. Coe. She lives up here on Mercer Island, just outside of Seattle. So I think this is, I loved what you were saying about how the narrative that we kind of buy into at the beginning of the poem that we just read, Given Two Persons by Wong Mei, kind of subverts itself, or are wanting to know what happens between this young 6-year-old and her babysitter is kind of flung to the wind, and something, she takes us on some other trip than we expect, or at least than I expected. And I have to kind of work hard to know. But it's a way, I feel like it's a way that the poem has to speak. It has to kind of break loose of that beginning, middle, and end that we've come to expect and love. That sometimes the poem takes us in that direction. It just wants to go, and it wants to subvert that narrative, and it has to, in order to say what it has to say. And that's what I felt about this poem by Wong Mei, that it really had to turn in a different way in order to say what it had to say. And so this poem does that in a similar way. Testimony Over Tape Recorder. So there's a series of poems in E.J. Coe's book about the women who were taken from the Korean Peninsula to Japan as sex slaves for Japanese soldiers. And so I am the young testimony over tape recorder. I am the youngest, and it's a persona poem, right? So persona poems are transgressions in a way, because Ko has decided she would take it upon herself to speak in the voice of one of these women. And when we do that, it's a kind of transgression that we have, I think, I have to acknowledge. It's a transgression, and I do it. I am the youngest. I'm 85, and yesterday I was 15 in a military station. My friends each dying one by one. And now I am old, and I will die too. Today the military gave me money, but I ripped it apart and ate it up. The president said, "I'm sorry, that was war." I stuffed my ears with cotton and plastered my breasts with gruel. The historian said it was necessary. Girls like me for war, girls for war, girls for boys dying for war. Girls must die for boys dying in war. We cannot be sorry for girls dying for boys dying in war of dying. Girls for war, girls for winning the war. Is it true? Girls with dug up bellies told they won the war. So I felt like this poem right in the middle between the line "and plastered my breast with gruel" and the next line, the historian said, really shifted. It was like the mind could not hold what it had to say in the strictly narrative voice. And it became a stutter, really, a stuttering, trying to find words, trying to say something over and over and over again. Because really, neither the president nor the historian nor a lot of other people really understood what the women had lived through, what this woman had lived through, and her friends. So I thought it in the, the fact that the syntax really fell apart and completely changed became the strength of the poem, really. It reverberated back through the narrative section, and I think left an unforgettable sense of something, of what happened psychically. And so I thought it was in a way also like Wang Mei's effort in her poem. It was an example. There's similar examples of the poem kind of needing to break away from the strictly narrative in order to talk about something that's maybe sometimes very, very, very difficult to talk about. It's not always the case with every poet, but sometimes it is.
Yeah, this is an incredible poem. I'd never read it before. You sent it to me. That moment of, I ripped it apart and ate it up. Like the first time I read that, it's like incredible. Yeah, and this shift. There's a question from Linda in the chat. It says, what does she mean by dug up bellies?
Yeah, I don't know. I think that was the mystery at the end of the poem. The woman must have felt, or the poet certainly felt, that that was the best way to say what happened to their bellies, to their bodies.
Yeah,
they were not their own.
An image that for me conveys an emaciation of starvation. It conveys potentially forced abortions. It conveys, just a loss. Yeah, I don't.
Buried life. The lives, the loss of life. Certain parts of their lives will never come back. Certainly they'll never, ever, 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 ever forget what happened to them, the ones who survived.
Oh yeah, and Laura's drawing the connection between the adult needing the money versus the digging up of the belly, and that sort of way that a sort of surreal narrative is connected through those two public acts. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And the poem, she eats up the poem, 4 lines later
Yeah.
too. Yeah. Yeah, it's a really wonderful collection.
It
You
makes
can,
me think about, I mean, whenever I think about lyric, like I'm drawn back to thinking about, the word lyric, and the lyre, and
mhm,
the urge of, or the tradition of poetry always being accompanied by music,
yeah,
from in Western traditions, and it's sort of that sense of like what is unattainable by the language games of logic, and sort of that poetry has always been with us because we can never speak the thing that is beyond the workings of logic. So we have this very limited tool of language that we try to communicate to one another, and it fails every fucking time. So we are like always in this like position of attempting to connect with each other but failing. And this, like Shelley says in the work of poesy or whatever, that that it's only through art that we have this like rare moments of being able to feel like we can understand another's experience. And usually that's by bewilderment, and it's by the thing that is beyond language. And that's where I always think about the lyric, as like the way what the lyre did, and what the music did that the words couldn't do, and how much poetry attempts to create that unspeakable thing. And it's all the different tools of it, whether it's by juxtaposition in the Carver, by omission, by this turn of syntax, a setup of one form of speaking, and then a shift into an undercutting of that. These the way the Wang Mei just troubles narrative and troubles the telling, to sort of get us into a place where we don't know how to think an organized thing.
I love that idea of troubling the language, troubling the story. That's really, yeah. And sometimes it has to be, yeah. And that's why we work on things for a long, long time. Has everyone had a chance in wherever you're located to see the new Leonard Cohen movie, Hallelujah? Is anybody? I saw it last night. In our little town, we have a terrific theater called the Rose Theater. And it's really terrific. And Leonard Cohen addresses a lot of this, both, he wrote till almost the day he died. He died on the day Donald Trump was elected president of the United States in 2016. Leonard Cohen just ducked out on us that night. I think, of course, in our lives, there are ways that we can't find the words to say. And at the same time, by some process, we're able to say so much. We're able to say so much. And poetry, I think of as the most intimate and urgent kind of communication. And I think music is really integral. It always has been, not just in the Greek, but in other societies who've accompanied their poets and their singers with drums, and we humans have, just the hands on the wall of the cave, say, I can't say it in the words I have, but here, this is what I mean. Just a simple gesture, a hand. How could it be, the hands that caught you when you were born, the hands that soothed you when you were sick, the hand you take before you go to sleep at night. So, yeah, on page 6, just to continue with the lyric a little bit. Okay, here's Sappho, translated by, I like this translation of Sappho by Mary Bernard, but there's some other newer, also terrific was it Ann Carson that did a lot of translation of Sappho, I think. So here's the bare lyric, right? This is the whole poem, maybe. I mean, these were fragments that were passed along for a couple thousand years, but pain penetrates. Pain penetrates. Yes, it does. Indeed, it does. Pain penetrates me drop by drop. Yeah. Well, there. It's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 words. And how much of a portal is opened by those 6 words? You know, it's like she speaks to us from long ago. As Walt Whitman promises us in his poems, he's always turning to us and saying, you in years hence, I'm right there with you. I'm still with you. You can feel me. You can hear my words. I can hear you, Whitman asserts. So here's Sappho speaking to us years, you know, hundreds, thousand, couple thousand years later. And it's the most human of experiences. You know, whether it's the knee that doesn't work anymore or the baby who's trying to get born. Pain penetrates me drop by drop. So that's the classic lyric. The first person, speaking in the first person, when our poems do that, we do that without even thinking, oh, I'm writing in a lyric form, but it's the first person. It's always the first person in the lyric. I mean, there are other things like Matthias and I were talking about metaphor. Metaphor really can and does pull the poem in interesting directions, I think. I love that about metaphor. And can get mixed in with the lyric, like Louise Gluck's poems are lyrics full of surprising metaphor, or Spencer Reese's poems, his book, The Clerk's Tales, lyric poems, but full of just wonderful metaphor. But I wanted to include this because this is just the bare bones of what a lyric is. It's human emotion, it's intense, deep revelation of the self to others. To others.
You know, since Sappho is, you know, the Western culture's official queen of the lyric, you know, and sort of the origin point, the origin story of the lyric. I love how totally Instagram ready this is. You know, I love how like this is like a totally contemporary form too. But you know, as pure lyric as it is, you know, I can't help but see the story of this too, that for 2,500 years, this fragment has been put forward by people. I don't know the history of this one in particular, but a lot of the fragments were just pulled from other people quoting parts of her poems in their texts and collected from there, or literal fragments of papyrus, you know. So the idea of like the history and the cultural story embedded in the fact that we have these words in this order as translated, you know, before us, and we tell a story about a human named Sappho feeling this feeling, and we connect with that. You know, it seems to me that like that's part of like how poetry does its kind of connection with the mythological, but also with the historical act of being in discourse with, you know, thousands of years of people attempting to communicate with each other. You know,
Yeah,
so that's one
the dead give us our language. I mean, that's our inheritance. That's where our language comes from our ancestors, you know, from our parents, their parents, our great-grandparents, and on back to Sappho, in one instance here. So
it's also a classic Sappho like perfect paradox.
Yeah,
you know,
isn't it?
The versus the drop by drop. It's like, God damn this.
Yeah. I love that idea. Yeah. So if you read this book by Mary Bernard or pick up another translator, you'll never get Sappho out of your head. You'll never get her out of your head. She'll show up on you. Because it's somewhat like a Chinese haiku or something. It just it doesn't take much. 6 words and people, human beings will pass this on because it speaks to all of us. I get it. Pain penetrates me drop by drop. I just finished sitting a session or a 7-day silent retreat, and everybody in the room had an aching back or aching knees, I'll tell you, to contemplate. So I love that. I love that. Maybe I'll go on to another poem, Matthias.
Yeah, do it.
Okay. So on page 7, so here's a poem by Tess Gallagher, and I thought it just might make a kind of bookend to Ray's poem. If you're ever in Port Townsend at the end of May or up here on the Olympic Peninsula, May 25th, we always go up to the graveyard in Port Angeles, which is a nearby town here on the peninsula. And we go up to Ray's grave and we read poems, like 30 or 40 of us go up there and we read Ray's poems with Tess, and we accompany her on that day so she can remember him in a circle of community. And she chooses not to be alone, but rather to be with people who know and love these poems and keep carrying his poems and keep carrying them forward. This is from her book, Moonbridge Crossing, which was the book that was published a couple years after Raymond Carver's death. So, yes, now we are like that flat cone of sand in the garden of the Silver Pavilion in Kyoto, designed to appear only in moonlight. Do you want me to mourn? Do you want me to wear black? Or, like moonlight on white as sand, to use your dark, to gleam, to shimmer? I gleam, I mourn. So I love this poem. I often write it out in condolence notes and send it along, because I love the way the poem is. I have no idea, except we're in Kyoto, where I've never been. So I just have this image. And we are like a flat cone of sand. I don't know what that means. So Tess really starts out, and here she's trying to speak about a loss that she probably, the only way she can speak of it is poetry. Paradox, yes. So we're a cone of sand. That only the moon can see, or moonlight, in the garden of the Silver Pavilion in Kyoto, designed to appear only in moonlight. So that's really lovely. Maybe she first received this poem at night, on a moonlit night, thinking about being in Kyoto without Ray and being in her house by the creek without Ray. And in a conversation with the dead again, the living poet in a conversation with the dead. So she's addressing him. Do you want me to mourn? Do you want me to wear black? Or like moonlight on white as sand, to use your dark, your absence, your loss, my loss, to gleam, to shimmer? I gleam, I mourn. Yeah, I just think it's a perfect little poem of loss, and how one still can gleam. I mean, not like it's an effort, but one does gleam with the intensity of loss and mourning, like the whitest sand that you only see in moonlight. So I don't know what you think about that, Matthias, or anyone else who wants to jump in.
mean, I think it's a beautiful poem. I agree with everything you're reading in it. Yeah, and also,
As a lyric, what do you think of it as a lyric poem?
yeah, it's gestural. Like there's these ideas and these feelings that are moved forward, but also even in this, it's not pure gesture. Anytime you have a conversation, you are creating story, even if it's a rhetorical conversation with the dead.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's characters who are, even if the act is not particularly plot heavy.
Yeah, explicit.
Yeah, the mourning is an act. The mourning is a narrative.
Isn't it interesting? To me, it's just endlessly fascinating how a poem can carry so much more than we can find explicitly in the poem.
Thank God.
Yeah. It's how that is in there is, I think, the what keeps me writing, how that happens and the kind of magic, the dream of that. You're the man who writes dreams, so you would the title, yes, as an answer to an either or question. Yeah. Yeah. And a kind of affirmation. Like Marie House says, what the living do. What the living do. It turns out the next day you have to get up and do things. Making a note to use gleam in a future poem. Yes. Oh, that reminds me. I'm just going to throw this out here. But poets are, you can tell just by Matthias and I are bringing some of our favorite poems and poets, and we're influencers. We're water to each other. We carry things to each other. We're water to each other, and we are meant. So Sappho wrote for the ages. We're meant to influence each other. And I'm an advocate of stealing from other poets. Terrence Hayes has just written a terrific book. I don't think I have it here with me in this room, but I think it's To Float Between. It's a consideration of the poems of Eldridge Knight, but he has a whole section on influence of one poet to another. And, essentially, I think we should feel free to really work with other poets' poems and honor them by emulating, trying to. I mean, it's going to become our own poem as we write, right? So I call it thievery, but it's also an honoring of other poets. The poem I read you, the Hamlet poem, is after a series of sonnets by Seamus Heaney. It's by one of the crown of sonnets he did that about his mother. And so I took a few chops from him. I just said, oh, well, Seamus Heaney can do it. I'll try it. I did it to try to learn something, So I think, I think the poets we love it's really interesting to take lines from them or words from them and roll them out in our poems and let our poems as we receive them change those lines up. If we take wholesale stanzas, I think we have to credit the poet, but beyond that, I think it's like stepping into the stream of poetry to do that. It's stepping into what Whitman was pointing to. We belong to this huge community of poets that isn't confined by time or space.
I always think about that in the Odyssey, there's that image of generations of man falling like the leaves of the annual falling of the leaves, and then Virgil reuses it, and then Dante reuses it, and Arius reuses it, and Joyce reuses it, and like that, just that one image becomes like a meme over millennia of like being like, I see you, history, and so like that sense of like what sort of like story of poetry is being told by intertextuality, and that thing that could be called stealing, or it could be called influence, or could be called meow meow meow, you know, like how, you know, very rarely do I really care about a poet, you know, like I care about poetry, you know, and that sense of how we are intertwining ourselves, and we are collectively attempting to be a voice that doesn't use language only for oppression and only for control and only for commerce, you know, and like using language in this like creation of more feeling, more ideas, more potentiality, you know, and sort of like all that stealing and intertwining and all that kind of like gives me that feeling that like we're in this together. We're in the resistance, we're in the basement, doing it together.
Yeah. I mean, I assume you're all writing poetry if you're here tonight, and you're going to go up to Tieton, you know, and I say up, if you haven't been there before, it's on a plateau above the Yakima Valley. It's on a big plateau. It's beautiful. You'll love it. So I just want to, say that what he said.
I think I'm gonna close out with one more poem, this Larry Levis.
Yeah.
I think it sort of speaks back to the Gallagher in a good way. I really wish there's a poem by Larry Levis and a poem by Attila Adnan that both begin on the day after my death. And I was gonna put both of those into this packet, but decided I would put fewer things in the packet. I don't know.
We're both over preparers, so you're lucky you got away with only like 20 poems from us.
But I love this. I'm sharing and connecting right now. I can't do two things at once. All right.
Yeah.
So this poem of Horses by Larry Levis, I love it in relation to this conversation that we're having tonight, because it's a lyric poem of attempting to understand something about just being, about why he exists as a living creature. And he can't get to that without storytelling. And then as it happens, the story seems to jump away from itself and broaden into an international story, into a story of politics and history. And let me see if I can get
Oh, good.
Oh, geez, come on. So I'm just going to read it, and Larry Levis is basically my hero, so I'm not going to say anything bad about it, but he was young still. Poem of Horses. Your friends nod. Their glances are like huts in which tools have been abandoned. Maybe you have already begun dying. Someone bumps into you and it takes root. A low shrub, disinterested. So you work late in an office building while a man vacuums the floors. You go back further into the blank paper. You go past the white smirk of the benign. You find the dark trousers of your father, the hairpins of your mother. You hold them in your hands while the jails are closing in Santiago and the sores on the gelding's withers are ordinary. They glisten in the rain outside the jail and say nothing. It was 1946 and the war was over. Your father hung his trousers on the bed. Your mother undressed and shook out her hair. They moved closer. As you began, they blindfolded the horse and led him further up the cliff, while the shadows pulled on their gloves one by one and went out and left them alone. If you know Larry Levis's work at all, you know this is like a transitional period where he's going from full Lorca surrealist ripoff into his more sort of narrative riffing stuff. And what I love about this poem is that it's really a poem about trying to see the moment of his conception and just sort of like be like, what? Yeah, sort of like there's an element of like any lyric poem to me where it's either like what or why or how, you know, it's one of the basic questions like who, where, when, where, why, you know, and like almost every lyric poem is just like to me like why, And then I had to write this poem to respond. And so we have these gestures of narrative. It starts off as if he's going to tell you a story, your friends nod, and then immediately he loses them into this surreal image of like where the metaphor takes over. Or the simile takes over. Their glances are like huts in which tools have been abandoned. And by the time you get, for me, to the end of that sentence, like, I'm not caring about whatever story, whatever the friends are nodding at. I don't care about the horses that have been introduced in the title. I'm caring about where this poem is going to move me and how it's going to move me. Maybe you've already begun dying. Someone bumps into you and it takes root. And the logic of that makes so much sense to me. Like, oh yeah, that's where death comes from. You know, a stranger accidentally gives it to you, and then 70 years later you die of it. Like, yeah, right, okay. But there's going further. You don't know why you're going further in the structure of the poem. You're being told, and then it's in that second section with a Volta-like move, that suddenly we're get into a narrative. And it's the you standing in for the I, of course. But it was 1946, the war was over, the father and the mother coming together. And then that as you began, and then it shifts out to this image of the horses that seems possibly just narrative, but it's told with so little context and explanation and grounding that the potentially real thing, I could understand a scenario where you would have to blindfold the horse, maybe to get them through the cliffs, maybe to make them not be starved. I don't know. He doesn't tell us. So instead we're left with this narrative moment that becomes like a metaphor, becomes like that dugout bellies where there's so many potential ways to interpret it, but it's through story. And then he pulls out of that into that, while the shadows pulled on their gloves one by one, which is an image of such absolute beauty to me.
Yeah.
That I don't care about the search for being. I don't care about horses. I don't, it's like the poem keeps arriving at these gestures of giving, and you said at the beginning about like the poem as an invitation or the poem as a conversation, and like, it feels like to me, the lyric in this poem is him just attempting over and over again to like invite me into something new, to take me somewhere that I could never have gotten to except for through this poem. And I think that, it's always a good poem to me when I feel like no quiz could be given about it. That like, there's no way to be like, oh, and this poem means meow, and that's the right answer. So so I'm just thinking about this sort of tension between, or relationship between, or spectrum between lyric and narrative, and how they rely on each other, how they use each other. I just wanted this one as an example as well.
Yeah, it's such a beautiful poem. I love it. Yeah, thank you for introducing. I don't know his work, so I shall track this guy down. Yeah, you'll have to send me which books to buy first, okay, Matthias?
Will do.
Yeah. Oh, it's just lovely. You go further into the blank paper, so there he is pausing and going, where the F is this poem gonna go? Or is it gonna turn into a poem, or is it just this is as far as I'll ever get? But he goes past
and also with the you addressing the reader as you read further in too.
True. You go further into the blank paper. You go past the white smirk of the benign. Yeah. And benign, maybe that is his own reluctance, our own reluctance as a poet sometimes to go down the path that might be difficult emotionally, or who knows. That's what I think of. But he does go, and he finds the dark trousers of your father and the hairprints of your mother. You hold them in your hands while the jails are closing in Santiago. So I mean, there's something forbidding in the first stanza. The first, as it moves forward, there's something forbidding how the father and mother are recalled, but then we're in Chile, and we know what happened there.
It's a bad time to be together.
Yeah, they glisten in the rain and say nothing. But then I love how this shifts the second stanza. You know, it's like, it's very cinematic and you're going, oh God, don't show us. Or I'm saying like, enough. That is just like the tritest step to take in film. Don't do it, don't do it. And he didn't. It was great. They moved closer. And then I love the little 3 lines, as you began, as you began. That's very sweet. That's very sweet. They blindfolded the horse and led him further up the cliff while the shadows pulled on their gloves. I mean, that's an image I'll just not ever forget. But the shadows pulled on their gloves one by one and went out and left them alone. That's beautiful. It's a beautiful invocation of conception. Inherently uplifting. It's conception, it's life beginning. It's a really wonderful poem. Yeah. Thanks. So, you know, we haven't been able to, we're gonna kind of wrap it up here a little early because it's getting late out there in the East where some of you are. And we've really talked a lot about poems. I hope we've given you some ways to look into, you know, the rest of the poems in both these packets. If you've downloaded them, you can, if you wish, you know, go into the rest of the poems and think about some of the questions we've tried to raise. I'm sure you've noticed that we don't have any answers for you in particular, except, you know, to think about the ways that the poem speaks. And I'm just amazed that it can go from Carver's day at the creek trying to fish a whole world to Larry Levitt's poem, very different kind of poem, another whole world, you know, go in so many directions, and Sappho's 6 words, a whole world, you know. So hope you enjoy the rest of the poems. It's been great to get to share this with Matthias and Laura. Thank you so much for holding down the fort at your end. And Jen Lynn, if she's out there somewhere, or you talk to her tomorrow, Laura, please pass on our best wishes. And if there's any last minute questions, that's great. I see Jess start talking, but I don't know if she's asking for, oh, someone else there too. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Wonderful conversation. Laura, you may want to wrap it up with an announcement or something.
Yeah, did you have any final comments, Matthias?
I just thank you all again. I think Kathryn said everything wonderfully.
Wonderful. All right, well, before we end, I'd like to encourage each of you to spread the word about these free summer school courses and of course about LiTFUSE. The next free summer school event will be Tuesday, September 6th at 6 p.m. Pacific. We'll be joined by Matthias and Kristen Berger for Saying Yes to Detours. Remember, although it is a free event, you must register ahead of time. So you can just go to our website, litfuse.us, and the first drop-down menu has a link to the online summer school events. LiTFUSE Unite, our annual poetry weekend workshop, is happening September 23rd through the 25th. Register soon. The classes are filling. In fact, already 3 have closed because they have filled to capacity. So spread the word, tell others, get ready for a great weekend of learning, connecting, and writing inspiration. Also check out Tieton Arts and Humanities for other awesome events happening this summer and in the fall. The various programs, including the 10 by 10 by 10 exhibition, which is currently up and running each weekend in the mighty Tieton warehouse. So thank you again, everybody, for coming, especially Kathryn and Matthias. It's been a wonderful evening, and we hope to see you all back on September 6th.
Great.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks all for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you, Kathryn.